Welcome everybody and Assalamu alaikum. My talk today is going to touch upon the latest Turkish incursion in northeastern Syria in an operation called Peace Spring Operation. I want to give some background and explain what's actually happening, why the Turks sent their army to take over that strip along the border of the Syrian-Turkish border, and why the Americans reacted in the way it was, why Trump gave basically the order to withdraw the small American contingent in the northern side of Syria, the south of the Turkish border. Let me just give background. Back in 1984, an insurgency started from the minority Kurdish population in Turkey. There is no doubt that Kurds throughout the region, I'm talking about Kurdish populations in 4 different countries. We're talking about Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. That's where the Turkish populations are. They number in the tens of millions, at least 25, perhaps even as much as 35 million Kurds in these areas. Back when the Sykes-Picot was redrawing the map of the Middle East and the start of the nation-state systems at the end of the collapse of the and dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, where the French and the British started basically redesigning the Middle East by putting a sphere of influence for the British, sphere of influence for the French, and redoing the maps and re-establishing nation-state systems. For one reason or another, the Kurds did not get their own state. However, the Kurds were part of the mosaic of this part of geography of this land, which called sometimes Western Asia or the Middle East. At any rate, the Kurds probably number in Turkey as much as 15 or 20% of the population, but they are part and parcel. They had their own historical grievances, not only in Turkey but throughout the area. But through the mid governance or rule of the AKP party, there was a process by which they start regaining much of their lost rights. Much of their grievances were being addressed in terms of culture, identity, language, education, all kinds of spheres, to the point that even the AKP, which is the ruling party in Turkey, was starting gaining even more votes from the Kurds than the other Kurdish parties that were promoting more nationalistic type agenda. And they also got much autonomy in these areas. But that came after a long process that started in '84, which was an armed insurgency that was led by a Marxist-Leninist leftist organization called the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party. This particular group was designated not just in Turkey as being a terrorist, violent group, but also throughout the Western Hemisphere, as well as in many parts of the world. They were considered terrorist organization. Their leader at one point was in Syria for a long time, until he was expelled and later on was captured by the Turks, and he is now in a prison here in Turkey. But there was a process by which there was a dialogue between him and the authorities here, and particularly the AKP party, starting in 2010. And there was a ceasefire as these grievances, the Kurdish grievances, were being addressed. So by 2015, unfortunately, we've already been a few years into not only the Syrian revolution and rebellion and uprising, but there was a civil war that was taking place that would also engulfed the minority Kurdish population in Syria. because they were also targeted when ISIS or Daesh, the Islamic State or Daesh, started expanding not only in Iraq but also throughout Syria, which involved more foreign troops, including Iran, Russia, the US, and Turkey. So it was a big mess. But the point that led to the moment where the Turks felt threatened was because the Kurdish population in Syria had their own strand of the PKK. They had links to the PKK group here in Turkey, where they also wanted to establish their own armed insurrection, which would have aided the PKK group here in Turkey, which has been responsible for many deaths, as much as 40,000 deaths since 1984. Now, this agreement that took place, where there was a peaceful process going on, a dialogue and negotiations between the Turkish government and Öcalan, the leader of the PKK in prison here, that process ended when the PKK decided to resume its armed resistance or its terrorist operations against the government here, which is claiming not only innocent lives on the Kurdish and the Turkish side, but also innocent lives from terrorists and other things, and especially happened during the summer of 2015 and thereafter. Now, while this was taking place, we need also to take into consideration what the U.S. geopolitical and strategic objectives are. The U.S. obviously looks at many Islamic extremist groups such as ISIS and others as being a threat, but that's not the real reason why the U.S. decided during the Obama administration in 2014 to arm these small Kurdish armed groups, not only with small arms to defend themselves, but they start giving them heavy armaments, not to fight Daesh, but also for another strategic reason that I will explain in a second. U.S. strategic objectives have many strategic imperatives, principles. One of those principles, sometimes referred to as the fifth principle, but let's call it just one of the basic principles, is not to allow any major power in a particular region to establish hegemony or a sphere of influence outside the direct control or acquiescence of the United States. What happened is that for the past 20 years or so, Turkey has been trying to exert its influence, trying to expand its power, having also gained the knowledge and the technology to manufacture its own weapons and to start its own independent foreign policy that sometimes defied the U.S. or went beyond what the U.S. was allowing it in the past. What the policy calls for, within the Pentagon, within the strategic planners, is basically to balance this power. This is a misnomer called balancing, but the short end of it is that you create another power to check this power. So this power, Turkey in this place, will not expand and become either a regional hegemon or a power that could actually challenge U.S. objectives in a particular region. This is a very well-known policy that the U.S. Not only applies in this part of the world, but throughout the world, but specifically and especially in the Eurasian area, because to the U.S. this is a very important strategic position. If you look at the map with Turkey, you will find that Turkey has many neighbors, but none of them are really strong enough to challenge Turkey. You're talking about Cyprus or Greece or Bulgaria or Armenia or Georgia, or all these, or Iran, of course, is a special case. So Iran, the U.S. does not really have a friendly relationship with Iran, to say the least, where they can try to play them against each other. And obviously there are many shared interests and common interests between Turkey and Iran, so it's not a viable option. So if if the U.S. strategic planner is trying to check Turkey's power, obviously it became very obvious that their best bet is to try to arm and train troops within the Kurdish population. In that case, Turkey would actually start to look inward and try to protect itself, because at this time it's not only a matter of being a foreign policy or a neighbor. This is going to jeopardize and threaten the integrity of the Turkish state itself, the Turkish Republic, since, as I said, maybe as much as 20% of the Turkish population are of Kurdish origin, and that means that Turkey itself would have to address this particular problem by all means. So the US started in 2014 to arm and train these forces. We're talking about Syrian, but a lot of them are also Kurdish, that they come from different regions, including Turks. And they were able to train as much as 30,000 troops. They helped the US in its fight against ISIS, but these kind of troops were not really just being trained and armed, heavily armed, that ISIS doesn't need, and that even went beyond, even after ISIS was completely, or Daesh was completely obliterated and defeated. That training exercises, these cooperation continued. And it was very clear to the Turks that these kind of trainings were not done for the purpose of fighting ISIS or Daesh, but specifically for fighting and for confronting the Turkish forces, whether it's across the border or for future. And the Turks have been very and extremely concerned about this process, about this development, and they have been trying to talk to the Americans, but the Americans have been giving them the short shrift. They have been ignoring their requests. The US itself considers PKK as a terrorist organization. That's established. And I'm going to show you now even an admission or a statement by the former Secretary of Defense of the US, in which he tells a senator in a hearing that PKK is considered a terrorist organization by the United States.
Have you ever heard of the PYD?
I have, yes.
Who are they?
They're a Kurdish group, one of several, a number of.
Have you heard of the YPG?
I've heard of them also.
Who are they?
Another Kurdish group.
Aren't they the military wing of the PYD?
They are, yes.
Is that right, General Dunford?
That is correct.
They're a leftist Syrian Kurdish political party founded in 2003. Reports indicate that they're aligned or at least have substantial ties to the PKK. Is that true?
Yes, we have.
Is the PKK a terrorist organization in the eyes of the Turkish government?
The PKK is a terrorist organization not only in the eyes of the Turkish government, but in the eyes of the U.S. government.
I will also show you another clip that shows that the commander, the U.S. commander, the general, who actually was training the Kurds, the PKK, he specifically asked them to change their name. The name that is being used in Syria was YPG, which is the Kurdish acronyms for what is called the Kurdish Protection Units. But these were well known to have been linked to PKK. This was basically the Syrian affiliate of the PKK. So it's the same organization, but they had a different affiliate in Syria. They called themselves YPG. It was the Americans, because obviously under American law they cannot train terrorists. They asked them specifically to change their name to Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF.
Misunderstood is the evolution with our counterpart in Syria, the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, interestingly, they came about that name because at one point in time, and I dealt with them directly, I was on the formative stage of the relationship with these guys. They formally called themselves the YPG, who the Turks would say equated to the PKK. You're dealing with a terrorist enemy of mine. How can you do that, ally? So we literally played back to them, hey, you got to change your brand. What do you want to call yourself besides the YPG? And with about a day's notice, they declared that they were the Syrian Democratic Forces. I thought it was a stroke of brilliance to put democracy in there somewhere, but it gave them a little bit of credit.
It's funny because even the U.S. Vice President, Mike Pence, when he announced the agreement with the Turks, he kept calling them Syrian Defense Forces. He doesn't even know what the real name is. But that general said that we asked them to change their names, and then I quote him, they came with a brilliant name because they associated themselves with the word democracy so that they can deceive people as if they are democratic forces. But these are groups that have been designated as terrorist groups, not only by Turkey and the US and the European Union, but by dozens of other countries because of their violent track record and because they have been specifically targeting civilians for the purpose of establishing their own or political goals, which is basically having an independent state. Again, I'm not taking anything from the grievances of the Kurds. It's that this particular group that has been trying to do it in a way that would be at the expense of many. And I would like also to point out that much of what we read in the media, especially in the West, is just a distortion of what had happened. The Kurds in these areas are not a majority. The Kurds do not even constitute 1/3. And after they were armed and trained, 2/3 of the people there who were displaced by these violent groups were of Arab descent. Hundreds of thousands of people were driven out of their home, mostly Arabs, by these Kurdish forces. And obviously this was a great concern to the Turks and obviously to other forces in that area, including the regime, including the Syrian regime, who's been fighting. So as I said, it's a big mess, different groups, but I'm trying to concentrate just on the latest developments and events in northern Syria and southern of Turkey. So the Turkish government for a long time was trying to tell the Americans is that what they are doing actually is going to immensely harm the national security of Turkey, and that by arming these groups, all what they are doing is strengthening not just these terrorist elements in Syria, but that will extend further into Turkey, especially after that peace process with the PKK here in Turkey collapsed, as I said, several years ago, and that is going to threaten the integrity of Turkey, the national security of Turkey, the peace between the Kurds and Turks. It's going to be a huge problem. And Erdogan has been trying to convince the American government during the Obama and then the Trump administrations to change their policy whenever they were talking about ISIS as being the threat. Turkey always said that they are the ones actually who have been fighting ISIS, and they have been obviously also the targets of ISIS, and that they can work together, but they do not need these elements who are trying to destabilize Syria, destabilize Turkey, as well as other countries in the region in order to fight ISIS. Now enter Khashoggi. How do we know that Khashoggi is involved? Because obviously what happened is this is something that is not being talked about much in the press because no one has made the link. And I would like to present that Trump is a different president. Trump is not the kind of president who actually looks after the national strategic imperatives of the U.S. like other presidents. So even though the Pentagon was trying to train these people, arm these people, and check the emerging power of Turkey, to Trump, this is not an important thing. To him, the important thing obviously is his own interest, especially if it is financial. So in November of 2018, at the height of the Khashoggi murder investigation, by that time it was a drip by drip that the Turks were exposing the lies of the government of Saudi Arabia and especially the Crown Prince and their deep involvement in the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and then the son-in-law of Trump, who is a very close friend to the Crown Prince. They were trying to extricate him from this mess that he got himself into. Trump and Erdogan actually met in Argentina during the G20. That was in November 2018. Trump tried to convince Erdogan to let go of this investigation, to give bin Salman or MBS a break. I think what happened is that Erdogan also he said that he wanted the U.S. also to allow Turkey to protect its southern border, because this was of a great national security concern to the Turks. A couple of weeks later, a phone call, and then Trump, lo and behold, now he has seen the light, and he says, and he announces that he's about to withdraw from Syria, to the point that triggered the resignation of the Secretary of Defense. That shows how deep this policy was within the Pentagon, to the point that even the Secretary of Defense was willing to resign over this particular policy change. And of course, due to the tremendous pressure that Trump had to face, he had to back down, which meant also that Turkey was not able to deal with this situation. They still are facing the threat. And then we saw months later how the Human Rights Commission of the UN came to conclude that MBS was back into the picture, that he was still the number one suspect. How the United Nations, of course, at the time of November 2018, everybody was waiting for the UN to take up the case and start even prosecution at the criminal court. But that cooled down a bit, and now we saw that there was a renewal way. I'm not saying that I have full evidence. I'm only trying to say, how I read things. I believe that Trump is banking on a huge amount of sum to his pocket from MBS if he can get him off. And I think for the large part, single-handedly, he has been able to save him. At the same time, the country that can actually hurt the most is Turkey. But I think also Trump has his own reasons, because obviously he has said during his campaign in 2016, and now he's facing the uphill battle in his new campaign for 2020, and he wants to claim that not only he had defeated ISIS, but also he is extricating the troops. But I think a huge reason, a big reason for this also, is that he was able to save bin Salman. At any rate, Trump, again, did not listen to his foreign security, to his national security advisors, including his former national security advisor, the hawkish, who was always pushing him to have wars in the Middle East against Iran, against different players. Trump is a paper tiger. He's not willing actually to use that, and he gave the go-ahead, thinking that would be also his ticket to save MBS. Erdogan took that cue and immediately went into his operation, and that operation had very limited objectives. The objective was to clear at least 20 miles depth within Syria, so that this would be like a buffer zone to prevent any kind of link between the PKK, which is the YPG SDF of the Syrian forces, with any PKK forces in Turkey, and also to try to diffuse any threats that could actually pose a grave national security threat to Turkey. Having said that, Trump also had 3.6 million Syrians in Turkey. Many of them need to be repatriated to Syria. So having this safe zone that he has been advocating for years, he wanted to bring back at least 1 million Syrians, if not more, in order to take them back to their villages and towns. And surely these people were displaced, not just by ISIS, but also by the YPG, SDF, or these Turkish mercenaries, these Turkish groups that have been trained and equipped and armed by the United States. So what is the situation now? Now, after Trump said that he's withdrawing. It was a very, he just withdrew 50 U.S. forces, and the rest were reassigned, and then the Turks went in for about 9 days. In these 9 days, they were able to advance to the point where, had they continued, they would have probably reached within a few weeks the 20-mile depth as well as the width of the perhaps as much as 300 kilometers in which they can secure the southern border of Turkey. Meanwhile, Trump is facing this huge avalanche of condemnation, not only from Congress, specifically the Democrats, not only from the national security hawks, who saw this as the collapse of the U.S. policy to check Turkey by creating this group. That this group was going to check it, and we're talking about the YPG PKK, a group that was heavily armed, heavily trained, heavily equipped, trained by U.S. forces, and which they call U.S. allies. And it's really allies just to the point that they were using the U.S. in order to get all this help, but they have a completely different objective. At any rate, with this pressure that he was under and with the impeachment process going on, obviously he had to find a way. So he used, colorful language, to say the least, totally disrespectful language to stop Trump. He announced some nonsensical sanctions against Turkish officials, trying to get Erdogan's attention. And meanwhile, he sent also his top foreign policy advisors, the vice president, national security advisor, the secretary of state, and basically he gave in to Turkish demands, because the whole operation, the goal of the whole operation was to allow the Turks to get their 20-mile buffer in order to establish a secure and safe zone where they can clear it from the SDF YPG elements that the Turks consider as being a national security threat, terrorist elements that they would like to destabilize the southern of Turkey, and eventually try to have an armed insurrection where they can have a state carved out of the southern part of the southeast part of Turkey. So Turkish political goal was to establish this safe zone, and that's exactly what happened between Mike Pence, the vice president of the U.S., and Erdogan, the president of Turkey. They agreed that they will allow 5-day withdrawal for all these YPG SDF forces from this secure zone, where they can redeploy back which would put them pretty much close to the Syrian regime forces, which is, of course, another foe for all, because this is another way, as well as within also the sphere of the Russians. They're not exactly enemies of the Russian, but at the same time, they will come under that. So it's not going to end, but at least the political goals, if this is actually, it's going to take place, where these people will redeploy, and Turkey will be able to have this safe zone, and eventually try to bring in the Syrian refugees that it has, 1 million or more, then obviously the whole operation would have been successful. All of the political goals would have been accomplished, both in terms of the secure zone, the redeployment of the YPG forces, and repatriation of the Syrian refugees. Add to that also that one of the conditions that the Turks put in order for them to totally halt the operation and end it is for them to be disarmed. We'll see and wait if the Americans would agree to disarm them, but if that happens, then we are talking about the complete end of this process of trying to check Turkey's power by creating or balancing their power and creating an armed group or a power that would have actually taken away from Turkey's ability to project its power throughout the region and establish itself as being the most important power. Now, what happens to the other forces? Now, when this happened, over a week ago, we found that many of the countries, not only in the region but throughout the world, condemned Turkey's action, even though anybody, any country in the world, be it the United States, Russia, Iran, any European country, certainly Israel, the Zionist state, any one of them, if they found that there is an armed group to their border, what would they have done? They would have let it grow and mysticize where they can and threaten them in the future. Any country would have actually had to do something in order to neutralize such a threat, because it poses a direct threat not only to its national security but to the integrity of that state. And that's exactly what happened. So even though this operation was condemned by many countries, we have to know that the condemnation has nothing to do with the action. It has to do more with the actor, the player. And in this case, the player was Turkey. That is not, we can't, we're not saying anything new here by saying that most of the regional actors here who have sided with the counter-revolutionary forces in the area, and now that they are in control of the politics in the Arab region, in the Arab League and so on and so forth, they condemned Turkey as if Turkey was hardly the only power in Syria. They never condemned the United States for being there or Russia for being there. Still, of course, they had a problem with Iran being there. But all in all, Turkey was not the only country. And it has, out of all these forces, probably it will have the most legitimacy of being there, because it's being threatened directly. At any rate, all these, they came threatening Turkey, and all of them now they have eggs on their faces, because after this agreement, obviously, that was an admission from the U.S. and a concession to Turkey's legitimate rights in terms of securing their own border. So what we see today is that Israel, who was also a big force behind not only the quest to have a separate Turkish republic or a Turkish state. We saw that in the northern Iraq. We saw that as they cheered the Kurds in Syria and Turkey. They were also one of the losers of this, because they have been pushing for this for a long time. It's part of their strategic plan, strategic vision of having these minority states, because that also legitimizes the presence and the existence of Israel. That has also been a big slap on the face. They were shocked to see how Trump reacted in this fashion, because part of the plan was to actually establish a Kurdish state. I'm not against or for a Kurdish state, because I said Kurds have legitimate grievances that have to be dealt with. But I'm against establishing a state where it could act as a threat to neighboring states. And having the Zionist states, Israel, championing a Kurdish state gives me a great alarm, because what they will do is to use that in order to threaten the other powers, so that Israel will feel more secure. So they will try to destabilize Turkey and Iran and Syria and other places. So they are using the notion of a Kurdish state in order to achieve that goal. This particular, I'm not making this up, this was actually a long Israeli plan since the 50s. We know now about this. We also saw it in the Audit Union plan in 1982. It was articulated and discussed by many Israeli leaders, including Sharon, who gave actually an endorsement of this as far back as 1983. At any rate, let me just conclude by saying that this is not over. There is a ceasefire now, and we hope that it will hold, and we hope that the agreement will actually be implemented, and that there will be a safe zone, and there will be a secure area where Syrians who have been threatened and have been expelled, and they have been living as refugees, they will be able to go back to their homes and towns and and cities and villages and try to rebuild their lives. And that I certainly hope that the collapsed negotiations between the Kurds and Turks could be restarted, where we can actually try to rebuild this negotiations and the peace among all the parties. But what has been actually the big loser here, and I can see it throughout the official circles in the U.S., is that this U.S. plan to destabilize Turkey, or at least check Turkey's power, I think is in total disarray. I think it was a mistaken policy, and even though Trump never had the intention of checking this policy, but because of his probably greed, thinking that he can cash in big on MBS, he has obliterated this policy because he never understood what the policy was all about, which, as I said, is part of of maintaining a U.S. empire by always checking emerging powers and creating other forces in order to make them busy and doing things that will not challenge the U.S. hegemony. I hope I shed some light about what's going on. This was not a lecture per se. It was more like try to give you analysis and insight of what's going on. And I'm certain that this is not going to be the last word on this. There will be more events in the future. I hope to share it with you. Thank you very much, and I'll see you later.